Without a doubt, one of the most fascinating programs in college football over the last few years has been the South Carolina Gamecocks. There's been many times when many people have decided to write Coach Beamer and the Gamecocks off, but they've pulled off a crazy couple of seasons. In 2022, they pulled off multiple top 5 victories and ended up getting to 9 wins. Then this past year, they also had a crazy season after starting out not very good, and Shane Beamer really has things rolling in Columbia, South Carolina. They have a superstar quarterback for 2025, return a lot of key pieces, and it seems like the Gamecocks have been rebuilt. Not too long ago, before Will Muschamp got there, Steve Spurrier also had South Carolina rolling, and in today's video, I want to talk about how Shane Beamer rebuilt this South Carolina program. We're to go through the pre-Beamer days, talk about each and every season so far that he's been the head coach, and how he's been able to get it done. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about Beamer Ball. Ever since Steve Spurrier retired from South Carolina's head coaching job in 2015, the Gamecocks haven't had much of an ability to shake things up in the SEC. Coach Spurrier had several good seasons with the Gamecocks from 2010 to 2013, as they went 9-5 in 2010 and made the SEC championship game, then 11-2 for 3 straight years from 2011 to 2013, but in each of those seasons they placed second in the SEC East, behind Georgia, Florida, or Mizzou. So they never really had a shot at winning the conference. To replace Coach Spurrier, the Gamecocks hired Will Muschamp to be their next head coach for 2016. Coach Muschamp had been coaching in the SEC for a very long time by the time he was hired in Columbia. He was a defensive coordinator under Nick Saban when Coach Saban was at LSU and the Miami Dolphins, and then he would return to the SEC to be the defensive coordinator for Auburn. After 3 seasons at Texas, he became the head coach of the Florida Gators from 2011 to 2014. He'd only go 28-21 during his time in Gainesville though, and then he'd return to Auburn to be their defensive coordinator in 2015. Given his long track record in the SEC and experience under national championship winning head coaches, he was seen as a good option for South Carolina. Immediately, South Carolina would improve from 3-9 in 2015 to 6-7 in 2016. They lost to USF in year 1 in the Birmingham Bowl, and they're led by Jake Bentley and Brandon McElwain at quarterback and Deebo Samuel as a receiver. The next year in 2017, Muschamp and the Gamecocks improved to 9-4 and had a second-place finish in the SEC East with a win over Michigan in the Outback Bowl. They had one of the best defenses in the league, led by defensive backs Chris Lamons and Rashad Fenton, as well as DJ Wonham, TJ Brunson, and Javon Kinlaw. Jake Bentley threw for 2,800 yards, 18 touchdowns, and 12 picks, and had a receiving room that included guys like Deebo Samuel, Brian Edwards, Shi Smith, and even Hayden Hurst at tight end. But that season would be as good as Muschamp's Gamecocks could ever get. They'd fall back to 7-6 in 2018 with a shutout loss to Virginia in the Belk Bowl. Then they'd follow that up with a disastrous 4-8 season the next year, and then Muschamp would go 2-8 through the first 10 games before he was fired. South Carolina finished that year 6th in the SEC East, and it honestly looked like they were at the bottom of the conference as a whole. Other teams like Tennessee had improved, but they hadn't. They had to find someone who could improve the program, or else they'd be stuck at the bottom. That's when they turned to Shane Beamer. Coach Beamer comes from a very unique background as a coach, as his father was the famed Virginia Tech head coach Frank Beamer, who's considered one of the more underrated coaches in college football history, and helped rebuild the Hokies into a successful program during his coaching tenure in Blacksburg from 1987 to 2015. So, it sounded like Shane had rebuilding football programs in his blood, but he was also known to be a pretty good assistant coach in the South. He started his coaching career as a grad assistant at Georgia Tech in 2000, and then moved to Tennessee for a couple of years. He was then the recruiting coordinator and corners coach at Mississippi State in 2004, before he moved to running backs coach in 2006. He then spent a large chunk of his career at South Carolina, coaching linebackers in 2007, corners in 2008, and safeties and special teams in 2009 and 10. He was then the associate head coach and running backs coach at Virginia Tech from 2011 to 2015, where David Wilson would go on to break the school's rushing record, and then he coached tight ends at Georgia in 2016 and 17, before then signing on to be the associate head coach at Oklahoma from 2018 to 2020. He had spent a lot of time at well-run programs like Virginia Tech and Georgia, and learned under a handful of coaches that were considered elite, like his father, Kirby Smart at Georgia, Lincoln Riley at Oklahoma, and even coach Steve Spurrier. But what made him especially intriguing to South Carolina fans was his experience in recruiting, since South Carolina had been falling behind in that department and would need top-end talent to keep up in the SEC. He was a good coach with a good background, and South Carolina was the top spot for him to take his first shot at being a head coach. In 2021, early on, it looked like the decision might have been a good one. He ended up bringing in both Marcus Satterfield and Clayton White as his offensive and defensive coordinators, as well as Pete Lambeau as his special teams coach. The quarterback room that season was a mess though, as it split time between Luke Doty, Zeb Nolan, and Jason Brown. They ended up adding up to 2,600 yards and 22 touchdowns, and receiver Josh Fan led the way for the team with 679 yards and 5 touchdowns, plus a big-time tight end in Jaheim Bell, who had 500 yards and 5 scores. Running the ball, you had Kevin Harris, who had nearly 700 yards, and despite all that, the Gamecocks ended up going 7-6, with a win over North Carolina in the Duke's Mayo Bowl. 3 of their 6 losses came to ranked teams, with losses to number 2 Georgia on the road, a 30-point loss to Texas A&M, and then a shutout loss to number 23 Clemson to end the regular season. But to start the year, they had 2 wins over FCS Southern Illinois, and on the road against East Carolina. Then, after a 16-10 loss to Kentucky, they won at home against Troy. But they'd lose by 25 on the road against Tennessee, by 3 against Mizzou, and the rest of their home wins came against 2-10 Vanderbilt, 6-7 Florida, and 6-7 Auburn. It was the perfect year for Coach Beamer to build the foundation though, since those games allowed a culture to be built that ended up being hugely important for their next season in 2022. But the 2022 season started out very rough. After a 35-14 win over Georgia State at home, South Carolina lost on the road 44-30 to number 16 Arkansas, who would end the season at just 7-6. They then hosted number 1 Georgia and lost 48-7. They would win their next 2 games against Charlotte and South Carolina State, but there was still a lot of questions about whether or not Coach Beamer was able to take South Carolina to the next level or not. Over the next few weeks though, that would change, as they had a 24-14 win over number 13 Kentucky and a 30-24 win over Texas A&M. They then would have a 3-game stretch where they lost to Missouri and Florida and barely beat Vanderbilt, and the questions came back, especially as they are now staring down 2 top 10 opponents in both Tennessee and Clemson to end the year. South Carolina ended up pulling off shockers though, as they would put up 63 points on the 8th ranked Volunteers, and then also won against Clemson for the first time in 10 years. They finished the season 3rd in the SEC and ranked 23rd in the country before they lost to Notre Dame in the Gator Bowl. Part of their success was definitely the quarterback position, with former Oklahoma quarterback Spencer Rattler coming in to take over for Doty, and Spencer ended up throwing for 3,000 yards, 18 touchdowns, and an SEC leading 12 picks, but had a good receiving core to throw to, which included Antoine Wells, Jalen Brooks, and Jaheim Bell, plus transfer Austin Stogner. The offense featured a couple of running backs with guys like Marshawn Lloyd, and they also had a strong defense anchored by Nick Emawori and Zach Pickens. 2023 would end up being a little bit of a step backwards for South Carolina though, as the Gamecocks ended the year at just 5-7 and missed a bowl game. They started out with a loss against number 21 North Carolina, 31-17, and after a win against Furman, they lost again, this time on the road to number 1 Georgia. They would rebound with a 37-30 win over Mississippi State the next week, but then lost 4 straight games after that. They got blown out by number 12 Tennessee, lost by 2 against a bad Florida team, lost 34-12 against number 20 Mizzou, and then 30-17 against Texas A&M. Luckily, their schedule would get a little bit easier though after that, as they would beat Jacksonville State, destroy Vanderbilt, and then beat Kentucky in a close game. Sadly though, they'd end the year in a loss to Clemson, 16-7. Part of their lack of success was due to how many injuries they had during that year, but Rattler threw for 3,200 yards, 19 touchdowns, and 8 picks, but even he was hurt. This would lead to some playing time for freshman Lenore Sellers, and many people were super excited for him. He had flipped around between a couple of schools, but the guy from South Carolina would eventually make his way over for the Gamecocks. Injuries also hurt the receiving room, and this allowed Xavier Leggetti to break out. He ended up having 1,300 yards with 7 touchdowns, and this got him a ton of NFL attention, and he was drafted in the first round by the Carolina Panthers. Mario Anderson also took over as the starting running back with 700 yards and 3 scores. It was a tough season, but that injury situation did not help at all. 12 of those injuries came on the offensive line, which was disastrous, and Rattler was sacked 30 times through the first 7 games. Even Coach Beamer broke his foot during a bad loss. Things were starting to spiral, but then Beamer figured it out again in 2024. Following the trend of up and down, 2024 was a high point for the Gamecocks under Beamer. With Rattler gone to the Saints, Lenore Sellers took over as the full-time starter, and the front half of the season was somewhat rough. After a close win against Old Dominion to start the year, the Gamecocks beat a bad Kentucky team 31-6. Their next game against number 16 LSU would continue the theme of close losses, as they lost 36-33, and there was some controversy at the end of that. The following week, they would beat Akron 50-7, before then getting blown out by number 12 Ole Miss 27-3. They also lost another close game to number 7 Alabama, and that one was a heartbreaker. They then would blow out Oklahoma 35-9, starting a string of 6 straight victories. They beat number 10 Texas A&M 44-20, Vanderbilt 28-7, number 23 Mizzou 34-30, and then FCS Wofford 56-12 before beating number 12 Clemson on the road again. They finished the regular season at 9-3 and ranked 15th in the country. There was a lot of drama as to whether South Carolina deserved a playoff spot, which some people thought that since they'd beaten the ACC's champion, they deserved to be in. They thought that they deserved to be in over SMU or Indiana, who in my opinion still deserved to get in. Well, we'll never really know, but in their bowl game, they ended up losing to number 20 Illinois 21-17, and this was yet another one-score loss in a season where 3 of their 4 losses came down to 4 points or less. Kyle Kennard on the defensive side of the ball won the Nagurski Award and was a consensus All-American. Lenore Sellers showed he was the quarterback of the future, throwing for 2,500 yards with 18 touchdowns, and they also handed off the ball to Arkansas transfer Raheem Sanders, who nearly went for 1,000 yards and 11 touchdowns. To make things even better for them, Sellers also had over 600 yards and 7 touchdowns, and he truly could be one of the best quarterbacks in the SEC next year. So yeah, despite Coach Beamer's reputation of having up and down seasons, I honestly think next year will be another good one for South Carolina, and could be their best yet. The foundation has finally been built, and Lenore Sellers is just a redshirt sophomore, and he has even more time than that if he wants to stay. 5-star recruit Dylan Stewart, who had 6.5 sacks as a true freshman, should also stick around, and their defense should once again be one of the best in the SEC. Jalen Kilgore should also stick around at defensive back, and he will hope to build off his 5 interceptions he had last season. But the main factor of success should be that the coaching staff at South Carolina is staying consistent. While their offensive coordinator left to be the head coach at App State, Beamer chose to elevate former assistant Mike Shula to the offensive coordinator position. Shula's dad was the great Don Shula, and while he failed to be a good head coach at Alabama from 2003 to 2006, he has spent years in the NFL and should keep Sellers playing at a high level. Defensive coordinator Clayton White is also still around, and the defense should be even better next year. So how did Coach Beamer do all this? Well, it's hard to quantify culture or put into stats that make sense, but he's created a competitive culture at South Carolina that's been missing ever since the end of the Spurrier days. He's been named Coach of the Year twice, both in 2021 and in 2024 by different publications, and there is a reason for it. He's turned around the perception of Carolina football from a school that should be in the bottom of the conference to one that's ranked inside the top 25 and could cause some bigger teams in the SEC headaches once in a while. He also has done it by recruiting well, which was one of the reasons why he was hired at Carolina in the first place. When he was hired in 2021, the recruiting class for the Gamecocks was ranked 56th in the country, and even that was helped out by a lot of last-second recruiting from Beamer and his staff. Since then, his classes have ranked 24th in 2022, 18th in 2023, 18th in 2024, and their 2025 class is currently ranked 21st. He's consistently kept them in the top 25 for recruiting rankings, and that talent is beginning to show up on the roster, with players like Dylan Stewart, Nick Harbor, Jalen Kilgore, and Lenore Sellers. Beamer is also slowly putting together a really good culture with a high-end locker room that is reminiscent of the teams his dad put together in Blacksburg. Frank Beamer made it to the national championship with Michael Vick as his quarterback, and Shane might be able to do it with Lenore Sellers. We'll have to wait and see, but what do you guys think? If you're a Carolina fan, how do you think Shane Beamer has built the program? What has made him so successful? And how do you guys think he'll do in 2025? Also, be sure to let me know which team or program I should cover next. Leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen, including my video about North Dakota State. I hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.